What is going on, everyone? My name is Andy. Welcome back to another FPL video. In this one, we're looking at the Gameweek 8 wildcard. So I'm going to go through some thoughts around why you might want to use the chip this week, what a Gameweek 8 wildcard draft will look like. Then we'll compare it to Gameweek 9 and go through some further thoughts about why you could delay it one more week if you wanted to. So if you enjoyed this video and you find it useful, make sure to give it a like, hit that subscribe button if you are new around here as well. So let's tackle the question first of all. Should you wildcard in Gameweek 8? So if you've got multiple Liverpool, Chelsea, Man United, Leeds, Brighton and Crystal Palace players and you've got the wildcard chip in that back pocket ready to use, then you should be considering using it this week. I would say that Gameweek 9 does have some advantages, but there's no need to hold on to the wildcard if you're having to take multiple hits. So if you've got 1 or 2 free transfers and you can get to 11 players either for free or for a -4, then the decision becomes very close, and it's probably going to depend on how much you value wildcarding in Gameweek 9 and how different your team would be. If you're having to take a -8 or more, you should just use the wildcard. There's lots of potential for points in Gameweek 8. So Spurs versus Leicester could be decent, right? Not many of us, I would say, have lots of Spurs players like Perisic and Kane or Perisic and Son. Some people might have one, but probably not both. And in that case, that is a good fixture, Leicester at home. And the same with Newcastle versus Bournemouth. I think a lot of people have jumped on Kieran Trippier at this point, but a lot of people don't have Isak as well. They don't have a second defensive player. So there is points to be gained this week, and you can set your team up for Game Week 9 onwards by benching some solid options as well, right? So you could have like James or Maddison or maybe even a Leicester defender, we'll talk about that later, on your bench. And also it has to be used by Game Week 16. So while, like I said yesterday, there are reasons why you might want to use it in Game Week 9, where you might want to try and delay it until Game Weeks 12 or 13, it has to be used soon. So I wouldn't go out of your way to avoid having to use it this week. If you can avoid a big points hit and get some extra points by getting in some good players this week and plan for Game Week 9 onwards, there's no real reason not to use it. So it is going to be team dependent. The only thing I would say is, I know the Premier League have come out and said these 7 games are on, these 3 games are postponed. There's nothing to say that more games couldn't be postponed. It would be very unlikely at this point. I don't think the Premier League and obviously the police and stuff like that would get together and try and work out which games can go ahead and which games can't, and then still postpone them later. But if something big happened alongside obviously what's going on with the Queen's funeral and stuff like that, we could see more postponed games. So I haven't hit the button yet, mostly because I'm still undecided about whether to use it in 8 or 9. But in the back of my mind, I'm just slightly worried there might be one more postponement. For what it's worth, I do not want to scaremonger and I don't want to panic people. There is no reports or speculation or rumours going on there's going to be any more postponement. So if you've hit the button, it's no issue at all. But if you're undecided, you could maybe delay it a couple more days. Just ignore the price rises for now and just see what happens, and then just have a team ready that if you need to wildcard late, you know exactly who you're going to go for. But otherwise, in terms of whether you should use it this week, that's the main things I'd be thinking about. How many players are missing? How many extra decent players can you get this week? And can you plan for Game Week 9? You probably can. So if you need to take a -8 or more, just use it this week. For anyone that hasn't got their wildcard, obviously this isn't really necessarily the video for you. We'll discuss that in the next few days. But if you have to take a few hits to get up to kind of 9, 10, 11 players, I don't see anything wrong with that at all. But should you wildcard? For most people, it's going to be a yes this week, I think. So let's take a look at the Game Week 8 wildcard draft that I've come up with. Now, the big talking point is probably the premium attackers. So in this one, I've still got 2, but instead of Haaland and Salah, I've got Haaland and Kane. Now, I have seen some people put together drafts with 3 premium players. So they have Kane, Haaland, then one of Son or De Bruyne as well. That possibly can work in the short term. I still think longer term, 2 premium attackers is where it's at. And I guess it depends on who you're looking to captain, right? If you've got Haaland and De Bruyne, you're probably always going to captain Haaland anyway. So some of that value from De Bruyne just isn't there. But I suggest for most people that are doing that, it's probably so at some point they can easily go from De Bruyne to Salah. So these things are worth thinking about, right? I know a lot of people are in the mindset right now that Salah is just finished, we don't need him, we're never going to need to buy him back. But I wouldn't be so sure about that. When the fixtures turn for Liverpool in a few game weeks' time, you're going to want to route back to him. But for now, I think if you are going to wildcard this week, you either get Salah in and bench him, or you just go for Kane and Haaland. Now, one of the big things with Harry Kane is, and I know most people are not going to do that this week, but you could argue he's as good, if not a slightly better captain option than Haaland. So if I was going to wildcard this week, I would probably want Harry Kane. The other week where he becomes very interesting is game week 11. So if I just bring you over to the FPL page, right, if we just bring up Spurs fixtures, I maybe should have already been set up for this. So in game week 8, he's got Leicester at home. Now, I know most people are still going to captain Haaland. He's been absolutely absolutely incredible. I'm not going to even argue about that, to be honest. But in game week 11, Harry Kane has Everton at home. Now, that week is interesting because Liverpool play Man City. Now, of course, you could captain Salah, you could captain Haaland in that fixture. The way Liverpool have defended so far, I'm sure Haaland's going to get something. But that is probably Man City's most difficult fixture of the season. So if you're ever not going to captain Haaland, that is the week. And if you don't have Harry Kane, the options become a little bit more difficult, right? You could go for Mitrovic against Bournemouth. I don't think he's a bad option at all. But Harry Kane provides you with a possible captain option in game week 8. Again, I know most people aren't going to do that. And also one again in game week 11. He could then be the way you get Salah back in game week 12. Because from game week 12 onwards, I don't think Spurs fixtures are awful, but you've got Man United away, Newcastle at home, Bournemouth away, Liverpool at home. So you've got Man United and Liverpool in the space of 4 game weeks. Whereas for Salah, who's obviously still in my team, so I've not hit the wildcard button. You got West Ham at home, Forest away, Leeds at home. Now, I don't care how bad Liverpool have been. I want Salah for this run. So you could look to have Kane now and then get Salah back later. That's if you're happy going without him for Brighton at home, Arsenal away, and Man City at home, which, to be fair, wouldn't be the worst call in the world. They are some pretty difficult fixtures overall. So I think if I'm going wildcard this week, I pretty much have Harry Kane and Haaland. And I think the third striker spot's not really up for too much debate. I think it just is Mitrovic. The only way that you put Isak or Tony or someone else in this team is if you get rid of Harry Kane. I think Mitrovic is just the best third striker. Nailed on 90 minutes penalties. I know that Tony has all those things as well, but I think the fixtures are slightly better for Mitrovic and he's better value because he's cheaper. So that is probably the front three that I would have. In midfield, you've got Bowen. Now, I know a lot of people are not going to like him because he hasn't done that well so far this season. We do think there's a potential chance that he's now on penalties. He took one in Europe and he dispatched it really nicely as well. I think West Ham have not had a consistent penalty taker that's on the pitch a lot. Like, they've missed a lot, right? Lingard missed some when he was there. Antonio's not great. Rice has missed them as well. And I know Lanzini was the main penalty taker, but he's not on the pitch that often. So Bowen looks pretty good, and his fixtures are also very good as well. So Everton away, okay, it could be better, but it's not awful. And then if you look at them going forward, again, I really wish I just built a wildcard team in this now. You got Wolves at home in 9, Fulham at home in game week 10. You got Southampton away in game week 11 as well. And then you could possibly look to get rid of him. Although the fixtures are good afterwards, Bournemouth at home in 13, he could be the way you get Salah back. So you could do Kane and Bowen to a cheaper forward, maybe a Solanke or Tony if you've got the money or someone like that, and then you do Bowen to Salah. So that almost works out a little bit too perfectly, but that is how I would be thinking about it. I think because Arsenal, that is a fixture that's on, and Brentford away is a pretty good fixture, and there's not a huge amount of other standout £8 million midfielders this week. I think having Saka there is decent. He is also your route to Zaha in game week 10. So you've got Maddison on the bench, Spurs away this week. I think that's, you could play Maddison instead of Andreas Pereira. I'm not completely against that, but if you wanted to bench him against Spurs away, not a bad time to do it. But the fixtures for Leicester from game week 9 onwards are really good. So again, I know they've had a really poor start to the season. I know there's not necessarily rumours, but Leicester fans and stuff have already talked about Rodgers maybe going, but his I think the payoff is just too much. So I don't know if that's going to happen. But I think I am someone that would like to, or will almost certainly always target the fixtures. And if you look from game week 9 onwards, Forest at home, Bournemouth away, Palace at home, Leeds at home. These 4 fixtures here, if you're ever going to turn your fortunes around, they are it. So I quite like the idea of having Maddison on the bench ready for game week 9. And because Zaha has Chelsea at home in game week 9, he's not necessarily a rush to get in until game week 10. So having Saka for Brentford away and then keeping him for Spurs at home, because he's no better or worse than Zaha in game week 9, that means you probably don't have to make a transfer in game week 9 without any issues that crop up, like injuries and stuff like that. So you could just then wait until they play Liverpool at home in game week 10. I know there's lots of transfer talk here, but this is how much I've thought about game week 8, right? Because I am very close to hitting the button myself. So you keep Saka for Spurs at home, then you get Zaha in for Leeds at home, Leicester away, Wolves at home, and basically you just keep Zaha until game week 16. A lot of people will go for him on their Game Week 8 wildcards. I don't have an issue with that at all, but I kind of just prefer this way around because Maddison has the better fixture than Zaha in Game Week 9, and I think it's okay to book in at least one transfer on your wildcard. You're trying to maximise points after all. So I like this way around. You could go for a cheaper forward, so someone like Isak instead, but I think then you're going to like De Bruyne or Son in midfield, who I think are worse options than Harry Kane. Now the only benefit, or not the only benefit, but one thing to think about, if you've got De Bruyne or Son instead of Kane, then you've got a much easier route back to Salah. It then depends on how quickly you want him back. If you want him for Game Week 9, I would suggest going for a cheaper forward instead of Kane for this week and going for De Bruyne or Son instead for Game Week 8 and then just automatically switching him or switching them to Salah in Game Week 9. If you're happy to go without Salah till Game Week 12, then I think you start with Harry Kane. So there's lots of things to think about this week. It looks on paper a lot nicer than it is to think about, right? But these are things that I would consider. You've got Reece James on the bench. So obviously we know Chelsea's fixtures are pretty good from kind of Game Week 9 onwards. So I would want him in my side. I don't think we need to wait and see how Graham Potter sets up. Reece James is going to be in that team. He's either going to be an attacking fullback or an attacking wingback. I don't think we need to worry about seeing Chelsea anymore before we make that decision. You could possibly go for a second Chelsea defender as well. But James Justin, again, if we're looking at Leicester fixtures, they're pretty nice. There's a bit of a differential who's nice and cheap. He could be an option. But again, you could just go for someone else if you wanted to. So that's kind of attack and midfield done. Then you look at the defence. So there's no Trent Alexander-Arnold. What I will say is, it's pretty easy to get a route back to Salah. Like I've said, you can either start with De Bruyne or Son, or you can just switch Kane and Bowen to a cheap forward and Salah in Game Week 12. It's much harder to get Trent Alexander-Arnold, and realistically, the only way to do it in this team without making loads of extra transfers is to change Cancelo to Trent in Game Week 11. Now, the problem with that is Man City's fixtures are very good after that Liverpool game. So they play Liverpool away. Okay, then they have to play Arsenal away. That game might be off, by the way. I'll talk about that later on. But then from Game Week 13 to 16, the fixtures are very, very good for Man City. So I'd possibly want to figure out another route to get him. And I think if we're saying that, you know, Bowen becomes Salah and then Saka becomes Zaha, then one of Zaha or Maddison has to be downgraded to be able to get Trent in. That's a possibility, but by having to move those funds around and having to move the funds from forward to get Salah, that's 4 transfers to do that. That's quite a lot, and that's hoping that nothing else crops up. So that is something to really think about. How much are you really willing to go without Trent? And to get him back, what are you willing to do to make that happen? So definitely think about that when you're building your draft. The defence otherwise becomes a little bit easier. I think if you're going this week, you've pretty much got to have Pope and Trippier. If you go for the Ward and Everson combo, who do have great fixtures from 9 onwards, they've got a really bad fixture this week, and I don't think most people are willing to give them another chance, right, having that combination. You could go for Edison instead of, or not instead of, but alongside Cancelo. That wouldn't be necessarily an awful option, but it costs more money. So it does look like Pope and Trippier are the ones to go for on a Game Week 8 wildcard. And then you've just got another slot, which I've put in so far, but it could be a different defender. Luka Dean has a better fixture this week, but I think West Ham's fixtures for the rest, not the rest of the season, but up until Game Week 16 are very good. So if we just quickly look at them, we'll come on to West Ham. You could go for Zuma instead if you wanted to, but they've got Wolves at home in 9, Fulham at home in 10, Southampton away in 11. Okay, Game Week 12 is not great, but then you've still got fixtures like Bournemouth at home, Crystal Palace at home, Leicester at home. There's a lot of home fixtures here, and I think so far is a pretty nice cheap option to have on your wildcard to cover a lot of other events later on, right? And then we've still got Martinelli because he's just great value. So that's roughly what the Game Week 8 wildcard would look like. I have thought about it a lot, as you can see from my talking about how to get Salah back, how to get Trent back as well. But I think that looks pretty good. I think the only transfer that's really lined up straight away is Saka to Zaha, not until Game Week 10. And hopefully then you can just roll transfers. So you roll it in 9, you use one in 10, you roll the other one. You're leaving yourself in a position to get Salah back and possibly Trent as well if you want to. So let's talk about why you might want to wait until Game Week 9 to use your wildcard. There are going to be people that are sat on the fence. I'm definitely one of them. I'm really not sure about whether to go in Game Week 8 or Game Week 9. I would look at what your 2 wildcard teams for this week and next week would look like. It could be significantly different. I've put a lot of different drafts together, and in some cases there's like 7 or 8 players that are different if I wildcard in Game Week 9. So you've got to be sure about the gain in Game Week 8. If you make a wildcard team from Game Week 9 onwards and it looks much better better than how your Game Week 8 wildcard team is going to work from 9 onwards, then I would consider maybe delaying it, right? Unless you are absolutely sure you can gain a lot more points by going in Game Week 8. So just take a look at that. Obviously, I've talked about this a lot through the first draft for Game Week 8 wildcard, but what is your plan for Liverpool players moving forward? If you're not going to have them straight away, then how are you going to get them back? And are you going to want them from Game Week 9 onwards? What if you see a really great performance in the Champions League against Ajax, for example, and then you've realised they've got a Graham Potterless Brighton in Game Week 9 at home? That seems like a pretty good fixture for both Salah and Trent. And yes, then they've got Arsenal or Man City, but we know the calibre of these players. If they start playing to the point we know they can play at, then there could still be points in those games. Plus, they're good from Game Week 12 onwards, and it means that you don't have extra transfers to have to use to get them in. You can concentrate elsewhere. So you really need to think about Liverpool. I know a lot of people are just going to be thinking we don't need them right now, but I think sooner rather than later that is not going to be the case. So definitely think about that. Is double Newcastle defence needed after Game Week 8? It looks pretty good for Bournemouth at home. Then to be fair, they do have Fulham away, but after that you've got Brentford at home. Again, could be okay, but do you need the double up there? Man United away, you got Spurs away in Game Week 13 as well, Chelsea at home in Game Week 16. So there are quite a good few fixtures there for Newcastle. I don't think anyone's going to be worried about playing Trippier and Pope for the next 3 fixtures. But after that, it does get a little bit more trickier. So you might not want double Newcastle defence. Or if you can get to it in Game Week 8 and then wildcard out of it in Game Week 9, that could be an option. I do think you still run into the same issue, though, about exactly which goalkeeper you get. If you go for Ederson, you're taking more money out of your team. Although, like we just discussed earlier, Man City fixtures are pretty good. If you go for Ward and Everson, that is a very big gamble that Leicester are suddenly going to start paying off handsomely, which I'm not sure they will in terms of defence anyway. How different is the third forward as well? I think for Game Week 8 you probably do go for Kane, but in Game Week 9, unless you really want that captaincy option in Game Week 11, you probably go for a different third forward in Game Week 9. And if you're not sure you want all that money in Harry Kane from Game Week 8 onwards, that might be another reason to delay until Game Week 9 and just make a different choice. It could be Solanke, it could be Tony. Suddenly the options become a lot different. Is the international break and more info worth waiting for and taking a -4 instead? So again, some of you might be able to get to 11 with free transfers. I've got to take a -4. Is that extra info from the international break worth holding out for? What if there's some big injuries? It does seem unlikely. And again, if that gain for you in Game Week 8 is big, then there's probably no use delaying. But if it's close, you could just wait and give yourself those extra 2 weeks of thinking time to build your wild card. Once all the postponements are out of the way, obviously all the events in the UK will be done as well. There shouldn't be any more postponements, at least not for crazy reasons, right? You could get weather and stuff that calls it off, but hopefully from 9 onwards the fixtures should go as normal. So I think maybe waiting for the international break could be handy for some of you. And obviously then you can take some punts in Game Week 8. So for example, if you didn't want Harry Kane going forward, you could maybe get him for Game Week 8 or get Son instead, knowing you're then not going to be stuck with them and can wildcard them out in Game Week 9. And also, what about Arsenal versus PSV? That match has been postponed in the Europa League. That's got to be played. There's lots of speculation that Game Week 12 could be the week they play it, and that means that Man City versus Arsenal would be postponed. Now, we can already think ahead about that with our Game Week 8 teams and limit the amount of Man City and Arsenal players we have to deal with. But obviously, if we get that info after the Game Week 8 deadline and before the Game Week 9 one, then Game Week 9 wildcarders will be able to deal with that a little bit differently, perhaps, right? And again, it's not guaranteed that will happen, but it is something that's being talked about. So again, if we come back to the fixtures, for example, Cancelo out in Game Week 12 could be an option if that game's off, but then you've got to think about what happens after Game Week 16. So it's difficult to know exactly what to do about that now until we got confirmation that that fixture is definitely off. But it is something that maybe Game Week 9 wildcarders will be able to handle a little bit differently. For what it's worth, I don't think there's much difference between the two. I know the teams look a lot different, or they can do, right? There could be 7 or 8 players different. I think the points you're going to gain in Game Week 8 will combat that anyway, and you can start to plan for 9 onwards anyway. The big thing for me is really just those Liverpool players. Do you want them straight away, or are you happy to wait? And if so, how are you going to get them in? So this is a Game Week 9 wildcard draft that I've put together. I wanted to kind of show some of the differences between going Game Week 8 and Game Week 9. I've assumed that anyone that's going to wildcard in Game Week 9 is probably just going to have Salah and Trent, and because of that you need to save some money elsewhere. Now again, you can do that with the Game Week 8 wildcard draft by downgrading players, but you've got to use transfers to do that. With the Game Week 9 wildcard, you can set up with that structure straight away. So I've actually gone for the Ward and Everson combo because the fixtures for Leicester are pretty good from Game Week 9 onwards, all the way up until Game Week 16. They're not perfect. They've got to play Man City at home, for example, in Game Week 14. But outside of that, they look pretty good, right? You've got all these green fixtures here. Wolves away isn't too bad. Everton and West Ham away, they're not awful, right? And I think if you're someone that's going to go for Pope instead, there is quite a bit of extra money to find to do that. So I wouldn't completely rule out Ward and Everson, even though I don't think I would do it. I think the other option is probably Guaita for Crystal Palace. But so far, their expected goals conceded this season are pretty bad. Now, I know they've had some pretty terrible fixtures, but it is slightly worrying. So that's something to think about as well, is exactly which goalkeeper you would go for. And if you want to go for Pope in this team, how do you fund that? Who's going to have to get downgraded? If we assume that James, Trent and Cancelo have to stay in defence, there's not really too many areas to downgrade because Martinelli is already on the bench. So in terms of cheap 6.5 million forwards, there's not a huge amount of other options. Maddison's obviously in there for the fixtures for Leicester, like I've spoken about. There's no Saka or Bowen. Again, you have to sacrifice something to get Trent, to get Salah, and to have Haaland as well. And I've got Zaha in from the start. I think if you're wildcarding in Game Week 9, you don't leave yourself an extra transfer to make. There's no point in having Saka against Spurs, for example, and then getting rid of him for Zaha. That's just something that you could consider in Game Week 8. You could also look at Bowen as well if you've got the money, but money is already pretty tight for this team with my team value. I think one of the other differences as well for Game Week 9 is you probably go for that second Chelsea defender instead of someone else, so Fofana. I don't know how much you'd actually play him though, so I don't know if he's like a deal breaker for, you know, having to go 9 instead of 8. I don't think he's that big of an issue. I think you're always going to play Reece James just because of what he can do. Fofana's probably not going to have that same attacking threat, so he is really just there for clean sheets. So there might be more exciting options you could go for instead. And then the big one is Solanke, and that's what I'm saying about that third forward slot. I think everyone's going to go for Haaland and Mitrovic. It's just who that third forward is. Now, most people are turning their nose up at that, right? Solanke plays for Bournemouth. They don't create a huge amount of chances, and obviously they will have new manager and stuff like that. I don't think they're suddenly going to go and score loads of goals, but I do think when they score, there's a good chance that Solanke is involved. So if you look at last season, for example, Norwich get relegated. They don't score a huge amount of goals, but Pukki still does pretty well. Why? Because he's nailed on. He's going to play 90 minutes most weeks, and he's got penalties, and that all applies to Solanke. And at 5.7 million, you just cannot get that from a midfielder. You've got like McAllister, for example, for Brighton, but the fixtures aren't great. And in terms of open play attacking threat, it's almost non-existent, so you're only expecting goals from penalties. I think with Solanke you can maybe expect them from other areas as well, and the fixtures for Bournemouth are pretty solid, right? Again, they're not a team I expect to score a huge amount of goals. It's just that involvement from Solanke. You can already see once he's back from injury, 290 minutes, he got his goal and assist against Forest. From 9 onwards, you got Brentford at home, Leicester at home, Fulham away, Southampton at home. The hardest fixtures are probably these two, West Ham away and Spurs at home, because after that it's Leeds away, Everton at home. So I think as a 5.7 million set and forget option, Solanke looks pretty good, but he's not probably someone you would consider on Game Week 8, and that is why I'd really give this a lot of thought, because the structure changes quite a bit in terms of the personnel you can go for. So that's what I would be looking at roughly for a Game Week 9 wildcard, but I'd probably want to change one of the goalkeepers if I could, but there's not too many other compromises I would be that happy making, right? I guess if Bailey starts again for Aston Villa in Game Week 8, then you could look to have him instead of Andreas Pereira, but I'm not sure that is a reason in itself not to wildcard. So let me know what you think about those two drafts, whether you're going Game Week 8, whether you're going Game Week 9. For anyone not on wildcard, we will talk more about what transfers and stuff to make in future videos, transfer tips, team selection, Game Week preview, and all that stuff as well. So if you've enjoyed that video, make sure to give it a like, hit that subscribe button if you're new around here, and I'll catch you again tomorrow.